All right, great. Thanks. I'm really appreciative to Josh and Jordan for having me in your customer summit. I'm really excited about it, and I'm excited that everybody will have a chance to take a look at the new book. I'm down here in Learning 2019 down in Orlando, Florida. So when Jordan talked about a hotel room, I'm like, yeah, I'm in a hotel room. But I'm excited to be here, excited to talk about creating effective microlearning. So let's jump into it. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat or to kind of raise your hand, and we'll try to approach them as they come up. But really, the first thing I want to talk about are a little bit of the benefits of microlearning. We hear a lot about it, but what really are the benefits? How does it work? And then I want to talk a little bit about the definition. I've got, I co-wrote the book with Robin DeFelice, so we've got our idea of what microlearning is, and so we want to talk about that and kind of share that and expand that definition. We think that having a standard definition helps us understand the field. We'll talk about different types of microlearning. We've classified maybe 6 types of microlearning. It's by no means a definitive list. Lots of types of microlearning out there, and then we'll talk a little bit about designing it, thinking about how are you going to want to create microlearning, what kind of elements should be in there. So I'm going to show some examples. I'm going to talk about some things that we think make sense from a microlearning perspective. So the first thing a lot of people ask me is, Karl, hey, that's great that you're talking about microlearning, but aren't you like the gamification guy? Like, why are you talking about microlearning? How did you get into that? So if you think about it, gamification is really the implementation of game elements in non-game situations, learning obviously being one of them, and taking those elements and helping to drive motivation and engagement. And that's really important. We got to have people, learners who are motivated to take the instruction. And I can't tell you how many people have said, hey, we've done gamification and it's motivated our workforce. It's been fantastic. We really enjoy it. And I think that's great. But one of the things that I started running into was these great gamification platforms, and then sometimes the instructional designers didn't always have time to create the right content. And what microlearning is about is the right content. So we have a great gamification platform. You want to develop content that's meaningful from a learning perspective. And that's really why we put together this book about creating microlearning, because we wanted to kind of combine the concept of gamification with microlearning to make those things work. I think it's fantastic combination and will be very effective. And now we kind of have the big picture of the gamification and microlearning working together. So I won't talk much about microlearning, but I won't talk much about gamification, but I will talk about microlearning in this presentation. So we probably, or many of us have heard of this thing called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So basically it's the fact that we forget things over time, and it's really easy to do that, especially if we're not refreshed or reminded. And this particular chart, I just put this in there because Ebbinghaus did this research like back in the long time ago, but it's been replicated time and time again. So it's not, some crazy guy in the, early centuries who kind of figured this out. It's actually been shown that over time we forget content, and it's natural. And I would say, we've got busy lives, things going on. How do we remember all this stuff? Well, one of the ways to do that is the research has showed that if we start forgetting in the forgetting curve, but then we get a boost, we get some information reminding us of what we're doing, then it takes us back up to the content that we learned. It shortcuts that forgetting curve. So one of the great things about creating micro learning is that we can get short bursts of content that can bring us back up to our retention of our knowledge and our information. And so I always think I give the example of and this might not be the best example, but I give the example of micro learning is kind of like, your mother nagging you all the time, right? You kind of don't really pay attention. You're like, Mom, stop nagging me, cut it out. But in the long run, when you get older, it's actually changed your behavior. You do take your jacket with you. You do take your hat with you after, time and time again as a teenager, to like mom saying, take your jacket. You're like, no, mom, I'm fine. And then you're like freezing and mom's like, take your jacket, take your jacket. So, but microlearning is not really like nagging. It's actually giving us the information we need to do our job, to do it effectively and to do it efficiently. So that's why I'm really excited about microlearning, because it gives us the tools to be proficient, to be effective, to be in compliance, to be good leaders, all that kind of stuff through this concept of microlearning. So what does the research say about it? So we saw Ebbinghaus and we saw the others. Well, this is, I thought, was a really interesting study. The study was called Information Impact and Factors Affecting Recall. So what affects your recall of information? This was given at a national conference. It's in ERIC, it's peer reviewed, but basically the study found that the impact appeared to be the greatest during the first 5-minute portion of the presentation, and then impact sufficient to cause students to report 35% of all the ideas. So when you got this information in as little as 5 minutes, you could recall all of that. And then impact declined a little bit, but was relatively constant for the next 5-minute portions. So that's 15 minutes of content. And then it dropped to the lowest during the final 15 to 20. But really interesting, research has shown that if you're looking for certification or compliance or something that you're going to be held accountable for, you actually can retain and retain the knowledge a lot longer. So an interesting thing is that your expectation of what you're going to do with your learning impacts how much you learn, which is really kind of interesting, right? If you know you're going to be held accountable, you tend to learn it more effectively than if you don't know if you're going to be held accountable, or even if you're not going to be held accountable. So the research is pretty clear that micro learning is a pretty effective way to do learning. This doesn't mean all other learning is bad or we should throw it away, or we can't sit in the classroom. Learning is a toolkit, and we have different tools for different types of experiences, audiences, and content. So we, as designers of instruction and users of platforms like MLevel and others, need to be smart and intelligent about how we apply, in this case, microlearning, but same thing about instructor-led training, same thing about e-learning, same thing about coaching, job aids. They all need to be approached relatively the same way, which is what tool works best for my desired learning outcome. And that's really what we're after, getting to the right learning outcome. So now we've got this research. So let's talk about some of the benefits of microlearning, not from a research perspective, but from an actual everyday perspective, right? So microlearning is a small, concentrated bit of instruction. And we all know personally that sometimes sitting in a classroom or sitting in an hour-long e-learning session, you're just overwhelmed a little bit with the content and all the information. And I'm at a conference, and everybody says, hey, if I take one thing away from this hour-long session, that'll be great, or a couple things away from this 3-day session, that'll be great. But wouldn't it be better if I could take one thing away every time I needed it? And that's kind of the idea of microlearning. I can take away things very quickly and get back to work almost within the flow of work, or I can refresh what I need to know and then go ahead and do that as well. So the lasting of only a few moments is quite helpful. Of course, microlearning is short time bursts, so that's great. It can be delivered anywhere on your mobile device. It can be delivered to your desktop. So it's really helpful to have that. The other thing that's helpful is it's less learning interference. So what does that mean? Well, basically that means that if you're learning a large chunk of information all at once, the preceding information and the following information sometimes gets stuck in what you're trying to learn, and you get confused. Was that this, or was it something else? And you may not know. But the advantage is microlearning, it's short, it's to the point, it's a narrow topic focus, and it's what you need. The other neat thing about it is it's kind of personalized, right? So if you get the answer right, it gives you feedback and you move on. You don't have to wait for the rest of all the learners to like get it, or there's always, class always has two type of people, one person in the front, and she knows like everything and she's getting all the answers, and wait a minute, I haven't even had time to understand that. She answers everything. And there's always somebody in the back who's like, wait a minute, can you please explain that one more time? I know you explained it 4 times, but I think I'll get it in the 5th time, right? So microlearning is personalized. You can get the information, you can grab the information, you can be ready to go, and it can be at point of need. So you're sitting at your desk, you're on your phone, wherever you happen to be, you can get that micro learning. So let's now break micro learning into its kind of elemental elements. So let's break micro learning into nano content and take a look at that. So basically, Robin and I define micro learning as an instructional unit that provides a short engagement in an activity intentionally designed to elicit a specific outcome from the participant. So there's a lot of words in there, and I want to start picking them apart a little bit to say kind of what do they mean. So first of all, let's take a look at instructional unit. So basically an instructional unit means that it's start to finish. So it's not come back tomorrow. It's not, I'm going to give you part of the information you need, but not all of it. It's not like stopping in the middle of the chapter. It stands by itself. It's an instructional unit that gives you the content that you need to reach the outcome. And the outcome could be a learning outcome. It could be a performance outcome. Ultimately, we want the learning outcome to go to a performance outcome. So we've got that kind of content, and it needs to be short. And what we mean by short is not lasting really long, just doing its job. Now, we not putting a specific time to micro learning, and that's an important point here because in the past some people said, oh, micro learning's 5 minutes, or it's between 2 and 3 minutes, or it's between whatever. But basically it needs to be long enough to do the job. And the problem with cutting it up into a specific time frame is that people will go, okay, well, let's take this lecture and let's just divide it into 5 minutes, because Carl said before, the research, you drop off after 5 minutes. So let's just break this hour-long lecture into 5-minute chunks. But that's not good. That lecture was designed to be an hour-long lecture, and cutting it up in 5 minutes doesn't necessarily mean that those chunks are proper or correct. And saying that microlearning has to be 5 minutes is like saying, yeah, we did really well in our training because 10 people showed up, and usually we have 5. Well, what does that mean? 10 people showed up. Did they learn anything? Did they get anything? So saying that it's 5 minutes, not really that important. It needs to be short, though. Obviously, 2 days is not micro learning. Obviously, an hour and a half is not micro learning. So it needs to be short engagement depending on the complexity of the content, the makeup of the audience, what their prior learning is. So a lot of things go into how short it is. But I did some research. I reported one time in research and said, yeah, it looks like 5 minutes. That research I did before. And somebody said, well, Carl, that's bogus because we don't know if it's 4.2 or 3.1. We never tested for that. I don't know that there's a magic number, and I don't think there is. That's why it's short engagement. So the next word there, of course, is engagement. And that means that we've got to get the learner's attention. And this is where gamification comes in, right? We're busy. We get messages all day, all the time from all kinds of sources, right? We get messages from, if you subscribe to a newspaper, you get, boop, here's your daily debrief of this particular newspaper. If you subscribe to a online newsletter, you get messages. If you have an app for weight loss or you have an app for exercise, you're constantly being, so there's a lot of competition for our engagement. And micro learning, just like any learning, won't work unless we engage the learner. The learner has to say, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this. So gamification is a great way to do that. It really gets people engaged and tuned to the event that they're going to interact with. And then we also need to have activity, right? So we ultimately want knowledge and performance gains. And that occurs when someone's reflecting, interacting, making decisions, making choices. A lot of times multiple choice questions get a bad rap. Oh, multiple choice questions aren't really good. But think about the process that your brain goes through to answer a multiple choice question. It's not as simple as you think, right? You've got to think, okay, well, this is the question that they're asking me. Do I have that right? And then these are some answers. And then which of these answers contains what I can recall or what I realize or what I recognize as the right answer? So that process is an activity. And when we reflect on learning, oh, even if a micro learning says, okay, reflect on this for a few moments, it can help with the learning process. So having the learner do something very important, play a game, make a decision, decide on a strategy, make a choice. All those things are really important. And then it needs to be intentionally designed. And what I mean by that is what I said before, you just don't chop it up. My grandmother always used to say to me, and I know this quote has been attributed to like a million people, but she would say, "Hey, Carl, I don't have time to write you a long letter." This is back when people wrote letters. I don't have time to write you a long letter, so I'm going to write you a short letter. I'm like, Grant, what does that even mean? Like, how's it harder to write a long letter than a short letter? um, to write a short letter than a long letter. But if you think about it, if you ramble on and on and on, you can give somebody some information, and they might pick out the really good pieces of that information. But micro learning basically says, look, here's the piece of information. Here's why you need it. Go do, right? It's very short, very concise. And so we've got to take some time to design that micro learning so it meets the need of the individual. So it maximizes those words that we're presenting. If we don't do that, then we're wasting the participants' time because we're giving them fluff that they don't need. Microlearning has to be intentionally designed to reach the goals that you want to goal. And where's that come from? That's your illicit, that's your specific outcome, right? We want to develop microlearning for a goal. We want to change behavior. We want to ensure compliance. We want to help with leadership. We want to, whatever we want to do, we want to make sure that's really clear when we develop the instruction. And then finally, we say participant rather than learner. And the reason why we do that is because in some cases, in some types of micro learning, you're not, and this is, I'm going to say this right now, this is relatively controversial because the performance support people say micro learning is not performance support. It's learning. It's got learning right in it. But some people are saying, hey, work is changing, right? We don't have to remember and learn everything. We just need to know how to do it. So if a micro learning can give you quick, here's 4 steps for setting up a router, and you get the router set up, but you can't remember how to do that later, is that okay? Is that learning? Is that part of the process? I would say in some sense it is. You're applying a procedure to set something up. You're learning from the micro learning and you're doing it. Doesn't mean you're recalling it. Doesn't mean you remember. There's plenty of things in my life and yours too that I'm sure you've learned, but you can't recall. So can I say, no, you really didn't learn that? Maybe you learned it at one time and maybe you forgot it. Maybe it's not important anymore and you don't need to remember it. The human brain is really good at getting rid of things that we don't need anymore. So I would argue that microlearning can help us learn in the moment to do what we need to do and then move on. So that's an explanation of what we're talking about. And really, it goes beyond learning to what I call performance support. I and Robin, my co author. So let's look at these different types of microlearning. So one of the types of microlearning, and so for those of you keeping score at home or in your office, I think there's 6 types that we talk about. There's probably going to be more as the concept of microlearning expands. But here's the 6 that we're going to talk about now. So the first one, and basically it's based on kind of how you design it. So view this from the lens of design. So this is preparation or primary microlearning. And what does that mean? It means it's either preparing you for learning. We used to call that pre-work. So you're going to learn something and then you're going to go do it. Or this is the primary way you're going to learn the content through this micro-learning intervention. And so micro-learning can be really good for preparing me for a bigger session so that everybody's on the same page. And if you use, here's a little tip for gamification. If you use gamification, people are more likely to participate. So when they come to that session, they're like, hey, I got this on the leaderboard, or I got this many right, or I've got this badge. And so you can kind of see and encourage people to do that pre-work. Otherwise, it's not always done. But also, you might want to give people content and you're not going to bring them in for a webinar. You're not going to bring them in for instructor-led training. You're just going to give them this content via micro learning. And so that's where it's primary micro learning. The design is relatively the same. The outcome might be preparation or the outcome might be actually a learning goal, but preparation or primary is one of the first types of micro learning and something to keep in mind. Now, somebody asked me before I did the session here a similar session here, and they said, "Well, Carl, what about like you always show apps and you show people holding mobile phones. Does it have to be in a mobile device?" And the answer is absolutely no. It does not have to be. I know lots of organizations that actually send learning pushes to my desktop and give me information there. I know other organizations that use job aids, and they're very short, and that's a form, I would argue, of micro learning, or infographics, a form of micro learning. So it doesn't have to be digital. It doesn't have to be on an app. It doesn't have to be electronic. It can be paper to get across the message. The idea is that we have a short piece of content that we want to provide somebody so that we have a specific learning outcome, and that's what we're after. So here's another type of micro learning. Now I think this is really interesting, and it's relatively new in its execution, but not so new in its concept. So this is reflective, really called pensive micro learning. Excuse me. So what does that mean, pensive micro learning? Well, basically it means that the micro learning app or piece of content that you're interacting with is asking you to reflect or think about something. And it might not even give you content or answers, but it might help you through your thought process. This is based on a gentleman named Roger Schank, who created something called Engines for Education, back in like the 80s. And this is a really cool concept. And now it's really enabled by chatbots and things like that. So, for example, let's say that you're thinking about competing against a competitor, and your competitor is kind of eating your lunch a little bit, and you're a little bit upset about that, and you're like, what am I going to do about this? I can't think straight. What's happening? Well, in this kind of app, you could type in, hey, I have a question, can you help me? The app would say, yes, what is your competitor doing in this particular area? So it's prompting me with a question, and I might say, they're trying to be a low cost provider. So the app is in gray and I'm typing things in blue. So then the system actually parses what I type in, puts it in prearranged kind of questions, and might say, what is one con of trying to be a low cost provider? So it took your content, being a low cost provider, it reflected it back to you and said, what's a con of that? And you might say, well, one con is low margins, right? You're not going to make any low margins. And the system might reflect back to you, then what can you do that's the opposite of seeking low margins, right? So the idea of pensive micro learning is it helps you think through a problem. It helps you consider alternatives. So I think it's a really kind of interesting way. We don't often think of this as micro learning, but I think it's a way of helping very quickly get people to think about and reflect. And one of the things I think that we is a problem that we have in our hectic, um, fast-paced environments, is we don't often have times to reflect. So technology, while it's actually increasing our environment, can also help us do something, which is to reflect. And we know from the research that learning actually occurs through the reflection process. So I think that makes sense in terms of thinking of pensive learning. Reflection is a way to learn. So another type is called performance. And that's basically, I think we've all done this, right? You go to YouTube and you click on how to change a shower head, and it gives you step-by-step instructions. Step one, understanding shower head. Step two, choosing a new. It gives you step-by-step instruction for actually putting in a shower head. This is great for reminding people of steps. It's great for you're in the field and you're doing some field repair, or you can't remember how to set up a piece of machinery, or you can't remember how to fill out an expense report. The idea behind performance-based micro learning is it at the end has helped you perform a task. Maybe the task is setting up a router. Maybe the task is changing your shower head. Maybe the task is filling out your expense report. It might not be a task that you remember later on, but it walks you step by step through that particular process so that you can do that process. Really valuable. Sometimes it's called just-in-time learning, in time of need learning, all that kind of stuff. But it really provides you with instructions to perform something to learn quickly. You look at that, you learn quickly, you do it, you look back, you learn quickly, you do it. So that's performance-based microlearning. It helps you perform better. Now, for those of you interested in the future, Google Glass, any kind of item that's going to use augmented reality is going to overlay on my shower head an image of the shower head, an image of what screws to undo, an image. So that's kind of future micro learning. But for right now, our phone is pretty good at giving us instructions, or our iPad, or even our laptop, because they're so light nowadays. We can follow those steps of what we need to do. So another type of micro learning, and a lot of people don't think this is a type of micro learning used in organizations, but it really is. It's called persuasive micro learning. And what that really means is we're trying to modify a person's behavior. We're trying to persuade them to do something, right? And you might think, well, that's bad. Like, we don't want to persuade people to do things they don't want to do. And actually, no, we don't want to do that, but we want to persuade people to do things they know they should be doing, but maybe not paying attention to. So, for example, workplace safety, right? We want to persuade people to act in a safe manner, even if it's not our first instinct, right? I always give the example, my father was sanding with a hand sander one time, and the sander slipped. And his first instinct was to reach out his hand to grab the sander, and it sanded off a piece of skin. Not a good instinctual reaction, right? So we want to persuade him that, wait a minute, think about safety first, not just reacting to the fact that this is falling on the ground, right? So that's persuasive micro learning, and small messages over time, we know, change behavior. And I give an example all the time. There's a group of men in India who were predisposed to type 2 diabetes, divided into two groups. One group got the traditional diabetes instruction from a stand-up instructor. One group, though, got text messages twice a day. And these text messages said things like, take the stairs, not the elevator, or don't eat while you're watching TV. And it changed behavior. In fact, of that group, they were 36% less likely to contract type 2 diabetes. So we're trying to influence behavior all the time in the workplace: safety, diversity, ethics, communication, leadership. Persuasive e-learning, persuasive micro learning is something that we need to think about, and we can do that by helping people consider alternatives, walk in somebody else's shoes, and reminding them of what they know they should be doing. They just don't always do it as much as they want to. So persuasive micro learning is really important. Another is post instruction or pull through micro learning. So we've all been to like a really great event. Maybe it's face to face, maybe it's a really good webinar, something like that. And then we come out of it and we don't remember everything, right? We went to training here how to use an electric meter for testing voltage, and we don't quite remember it. Well, pull through or post instruction micro learning is basically, after you've gone to an event, you get reminders of key pieces of content that you learned in the conference, workshop, or webinar. And what that does is it says, oh, okay, I need to do this. I need to do that. Oh, that's how I use that. So it refreshes it. And the really interesting thing, again, from the research, is that it shows that when we recall something in our mind, like, we are not, humans are not computers. Spoiler alert, right? We're not computers, and we don't have photographic memories. So we actually manipulate, change, construct our memories about things. Even if it seems very objective, we add some of our own flavor to our memory. And the process of recalling information changes that memory. So the more time we recall the information, the better and easier it is for us to actually recall that information, because it's not a photographic memory. We're not just going through a file cabinet, we're going down different paths. So post instruction helps with the follow through. And there's been some other really interesting research which says, so I don't know about you, but when I was younger and I needed to study in school, my parents would say, Carl, sit at the same desk every day, very quietly, very dim light, no noise in the background, and you study your content, and that's how you learn. So, all right, I did that, and I went and I did pretty well in the tests. But after the test, I couldn't recall that information. It's hard to pull it back up. It turns out that learning in a quiet, uninterrupted space in the same place every time, all the time, is horrible for long-term recall. It's great for short-term recall, but if we want somebody to do something long-term, we need to learn that and have it reinforced in all kinds of crazy environments. So I always give the example of, think of a professional athlete. So let's just pick um, professional basketball, right? So, and let's pick the WNBA, right? By the time you get to the WNBA, you know how to play basketball. You know how to make the free throws, you know how to make the plays, you know the pick and roll, you know all that. Yet, nevertheless, every WNBA team still has practice. Why do they keep practicing? These women know basketball better than almost anybody else. Why do they need practice? Because you want to practice under different circumstances so that no matter what the circumstances is, you can actually perform in that environment. So you want to practice in a loud arena. You want to practice in a quiet arena, in kind of a medium arena. You want to practice when it's cold. You want to practice when it's warm. In fact, one research, which is really interesting, said if you want to practice basketball free throws, you should stand on the line, make several shots, and then move a quarter inch, and then try it again, and then move an inch and try it again. Don't practice in the same place every time, because in a game, you're not always going to be exactly on that line to exactly make that shot. Learning, same thing. You're not going to be in a quiet place with your computer, all nice and warm, and learning how to do it. It might be totally hectic situation. Things are malfunctioning. You got to figure out what to do. You want to practice in those circumstances. And post instruction can give you a bunch of different scenarios in this micro learning to allow you to practice in those different situations and those different scenarios. So think about practicing, kind of under varied conditions for ideal recall. In fact, the concept is called desirable difficulty. And so a certain level of difficulty is desirable, not necessarily for ease of learning, but for ease of recall, ability to recall. And it turns out there's a little bit of a converse relationship between as easy as we can learn something, it's not always that easy to recall it. Because, if you struggle to learn something and then you finally get it, you remember that for a long, long time. But if you get things like really easy, no problem, easy peasy, recalling it might not be so simple. So if you're going to do post instruction micro learning, make sure that you vary it and make it different and make different scenarios. I did a study one time at this company. They had a chemical dump. They had a fish kill. Somebody dumped chemicals down the drain, and they said, we want to see if our training was adequate and what happened. And so I interviewed a lot of people, and they had one e-learning module on not dumping stuff down the drain. It lasted 7 minutes. So 365 days a year, you take 7 minutes out of 365 days a year, and you take this course. And the fascinating thing to me was when I interviewed people about the course, they said, yeah, that course is really boring. It's the same content every year. I'm like, wow, of all the things you're doing all the time, you take 7 minutes for this course, but you remember the moment you log back into that course that, yeah, I know what it is because I've done this training before. So if you're going to do refresher training, you're going to do post instruction training, don't do the same 7 minutes every single time, because people will naturally tune out. We tune out the things that are the same that we encounter all the time, even if it's for 7 minutes once a year. So you do want to have some variety in what you're providing post instruction. Now, here's another type of microlearning. This is called practice-based microlearning, which I think is fascinating. There's a huge trend right now to have coaches or to have hints and tips in your pocket on your smartphone, right? On your smart device, right? So one of the ones I'm going to give an example is one called Presenter. And I view this as kind of micro learning. Maybe you were pushing the boundaries a little bit, but this is really interesting because it allows you to practice and gives you feedback, in this case, on your presentation skills. So how this works is you go into the app and it says, what would you like to do? And I'd like to practice presenting, right? This is called Presentar, Presentr, lowercase r. I want to practice presenting. So you click on that and then it says, are you ready to present? And yeah. So I'm going to record my presentation into my phone, which already has, a recorder built in. So that's no big deal. And I say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and record. And it asks me to pick a topic. Now I can do my own topic. Like I'm going to practice for a presentation for MLevel's customer summit, or I'm going to talk just about my favorite TV shows just to see how I talk extemporaneously, or my favorite pastime, or whatever. So I'll pick a topic, and then it has a countdown, 3, 2, 1, start, and you start talking into your phone. It has to be 2 feet away, and you talk into your phone, and then you can go topic to topic, and you have to talk for about 30 seconds. Once you do that, you're like, okay, I'm finished, and then ask you to reflect. What were you aware of what you were doing differently? Maybe I was aware, maybe not, and maybe I'm not sure. But the really cool thing is when I'm done, it gives me a score in 4 particular areas. One is how loud I was. 2 is my pacing. And 3 is, did I use and ah, what I call interrupter words? And finally, I can also put in power words. Like I want to make sure I mention maybe micro learning, or there's a great word that I think is going to drive home my point. I want to make sure it's in there. So I actually get a score called my presenter score, and I can get the volume score, my pacing score, my filler word score. Let me click on filler words. I click on that. I can see, I had 2 filler words. I wonder what they were. Oh, I had and ah, which I used twice, and so, which I used twice. So literally, I have a speech coach in my pocket, in my smartphone. So whenever I am thinking about, oh, I've got 10 minutes at the airport, or I've got 5 minutes in my car before I go in and see a client, I'm just going to practice. I'm going to see how I did. So I think practice-based microlearning is really kind of an interesting thing that we're going to see in terms of providing that coaching feedback to us as we go through different activities. And it even has games in it so that you can practice. You have to have your volume in a certain range, and it will give you points if you do that. There's pacing for how fast you're speaking. All those kind of things can be really helpful when you look at the types of microlearning. So those are, right now, a list of what I think are elements or parts of microlearning. There certainly are different, um, there will be different appliances and applications of microlearning, as this thing grows. The other thing that I want to point out is that um, the whole definition of microlearning, while we kind of defined it here, as technology changes, as the workplace changes, those concepts will change a little bit, and we've got to be kind of open to what that is. But one of the things I alluded to in my presentation was, it needs to be purposeful and deliberate. So let's talk a little bit about just developing microlearning so we can think about how we would want to do that. So the very first thing that we need to think about are the participants. So who is going to be receiving the micro learning that you're creating? Because you would create for a new sales representative a lot differently than a seasoned sales representative. So there's a lot of variability between those two. So you want to really be careful, maybe different from a call center, different from an organizational leader. So it's really important to think about and consider who your participants are so that you focus the training directly for them. So this is kind of an interesting story. I was doing a card game, not necessarily digital, an actual analog card game in a classroom in one of my workshops. And I had people play the card game. And then I said, so what do you think? And it was a card game I created. So this one woman, she was like, no, this card game is horrible. I don't like it. Wouldn't fit my learners, wouldn't fit the needs at all. Just don't like the game. So, I'm feeling a little defeated. And then I asked, calling a lady in the back, and she goes, oh my gosh, I love this game. It fits perfectly with the sales reps that I teach. The content is perfect. I could use this game. Now, the point wasn't, the game was good or bad. The game didn't matter. It was who the participants were. So the game didn't change at all. It was the same game, but it was the frame through which they looked at the learning intervention. So when you think about developing instruction for people, participants, it's really important. Don't say, oh yeah, everybody, this is for everybody. Like everybody will get it, right? They don't. We all look through things for different lenses. So make sure that you have the appropriate lens for whom is taking that instruction, or for whoever's taking the instruction. Whom sounds a little formal. So then we have the performance. This is really important to think about. So think about who you're creating an instruction for, but then what do you want them to do? This is, I think, one of the most important things. I was in a meeting one time and we were talking about building this big elaborate training program. So I turned to the person and said, well, I just have one question. When this training is done, what do you want the person to be able to do? What's the outcome? And they looked at me and said, wow, that's a really good question. And I said, it shouldn't be. That should be like a really obvious question. So when you're developing microlearning, the obvious question is, what do you want the person to do when they're done with microlearning? Do you want them to be able to detail a product? Do you want them to be able to be in compliance? Do you want them to have a good review with a subordinate? Like whatever it is, you've got to specify that early so that people know what it is. Is it behavior? Is it we want somebody to think about quality first? Some are a little harder to measure than others, but all of them can be important, and you should express what they are when you talk about the performance. Now, another thing you need to do is think about the place. You're like, oh, it's microlearning, it'll take place anywhere. Well, what if they work in a really loud environment? What if they work in a retail store and them being on their mobile device looks like they're blowing off a customer, right? So is it on the shop floor where they can't hear anything? Or is it in the office where it's really quiet and it's actually on their laptop? Or is it at home? Do we think they're going to learn at home? Wherever it happens to be, you need to think about where that learning experience is going to take place. Now, you're not going to be able to know every experience. Somebody might use it at home when it was really intended for the office, or they might use it waiting for a client when it was not intended for that at all, or wherever it happens to be might be a little bit different. But overall, you should think about. So I have some apps, for example, I use Duolingo, trying to learn Portuguese. It's very slow going. But one of the things that it does is obviously it's language, so it speaks the language. But sometimes it says, are you in a place where you can't listen? And I say, yeah, I'm in a place I can't listen. And then it doesn't have that exercise, right? So maybe think about how are you going to configure it for these different environments? So where's the learning going to take place? Also, think of the instructional strategy, the pedagogy or andragogy, if you think about adult learning, right? If you teach concepts like safety, you might have examples and non-examples. If you're teaching leadership, you might have a case study. If you're teaching declarative knowledge, you might have comprehension or prediction or analysis, right? You really want to think about what instructional strategies are you using. And this is one of the things that we spent a lot of time in the book talking about. And Jordan, someone reading that book on vacation, tell them thank you and to like expand their genre, right? I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway, uh, um, make sure that you think about purposefully how you're designing the instruction so that you have the impact. The difference between information and instruction is instruction has a strategy behind it, right? You have an outcome that you want to reach. And so you're going to do a certain thing. Maybe you're going to string several micro learning modules together because you want to move the behavior this way. Maybe you're going to start by gaining attention, and then you're going to reinforce it over time through games so that they're going to get that information. Maybe you're going to create a leaderboard so you create a sense of competition so people are learning independently to get that. Whatever it happens to be purposeful about the strategy that you're using to design microlearning, and you'll have a better outcome with microlearning. So also then finally think about the platform. Where are they going to be watching this? Is it gamified? Is it not gamified? The great thing about gamified platforms, and I'm going to put a plug in for MLevel, but for MLevel is the data that you can get to on the back end is really important for reviewing your strategy, for setting up your strategy, for making sure your strategy is on track, making sure people are engaged. We talked about engagement before. So it's really important to that you take the platform and the tools that are on the back end that you can monitor. One of the great things about micro learning as opposed to a lot of e-learning is after the fact, right? I got to finish the whole hour-long module or series of modules, and then I just have a score. I don't know individually how people did or individually how they answered on one question or what wrong answer they picked. I just have the score. Micro learning allows you to really hone in on, okay, what are people getting or not getting? Where are the holes in my instruction? Where are the holes in their um, application of this knowledge? How do I look through that? Those things are really important and a great tool for us as designers of instruction. With the whole advent of micro learning is now we have this. I can know if I send out something every day, I can know by the end of the week whether or not Carl got that concept. And then 2 weeks later, I can test to see if Carl remembered that concept. That's a great tool to have, especially if I'm rolling out a new initiative or a new concept or something like that. So make sure that you think about the platform and the back end. I would argue it's more important now than ever. And to make this easy for you, here's like a little worksheet that you can use. What's the performance or learning outcome? Who are the people? Where it's occurring? So put this all on one sheet or several sheets, and you can get a sense of what you want to do. If you're going to deliver it with a video-based example, text-based, game-based, whatever that happens to be, create this so that you can have this sense of where these things are. And then here is just a little bit more defined. So the use case, that's the type of micro learning. Is it pensive? Is it performance? Is it persuasive? Who are the learners? You might even want to do a learner persona if you want to get really detailed. What's the content? What are they going to be doing? What's the access to the content? Well, what am I going to develop it in? I might develop it in Rise. I might develop it in MLevel. And then how am I going to measure this, right? So you want to have that measurement in there so that you can find out what might be the right level of measurement and what you're going to do. So this is just kind of pointing out everything that I just said about the content, about the development, the measures, the strategies you need to think about. The final thing I want to say about micro learning as I'm wrapping up here is that micro learning needs to be part of a larger ecosystem. So a lot of times people say, "Oh, okay, we're just going to implement micro learning. This will be great." But really, what you should think about when you're implementing your micro learning is how does it fit into your larger learning ecostructure? Is your micro learning going to be pre-coaching? So I'm going to give some information and then I'm going to have a one-on-one physical coach. Is your micro learning going to remind people of the job aids? Is your micro learning going to be before ILT, right? Before the instructor-led training? Is your micro learning going to work hand in hand as a reminder from your e-learning modules, right? All of that is really important as you begin to think about um, expanding the universe of learning and working on learner performance. So learner performance really comes as a result of a lot of different inputs. So you can't just tell somebody something one time and expect them to do it. You might get lucky and they might do it, but chances are you're going to need to remind them, you're going to need to kind of nudge them in the right direction. And having a whole learning ecosystem, of which micro learning is a key component, can help you achieve your goals. But you can't replace um, all learning all the time with micro learning. You need in your organization people that have deep learning. I always say that Sully Sullenberger didn't land that plane on the Hudson based on a series of micro learning modules that he happened to watch on the way down, right? That man had deep and rich knowledge of flight simulators, of gliders. He taught people how to react in emergency situations. He was totally prepared, even though he didn't know it at the time, for that type of incident because he had that deep, rich learning. So when you look out over your learning ecosystem, yes, there are plenty of opportunities for microlearning and plenty of opportunities to add microlearning into what you're doing if you want to, if you're not doing it, or to expand it if you are doing it. I think most people are probably doing it because they're customers of MLevel. But think about now, I've got this larger learning ecosystem. Maybe you're using for compliance. Think about how it might work for leadership, right? Maybe you're using it to augment e-learning, but think of how it might augment coaching or mentoring or things like that. So think about using it to support a larger ecosystem of learning, and you'll have like really good results from that. So let me kind of summarize what I talked about today. So one is the benefits of microlearning: better retention, better application, targeted instruction, things that you can do that we can't do with larger, dare I say, more cumbersome type of instruction. The definition, the main thing I want you to take away from that definition, two main things. I only have one here, but two are: one, it's not time dependent. So don't say arbitrarily slap 5 minutes on it, or 3 minutes, or 10 minutes, or whatever. It's really to meet a learning outcome. And second, I want you to think of it as not necessarily a learner, but a participant, right? I'm participating in this handheld coaching app that's teaching me how to present better. I'm using the step-by-step instructions to hook up a router, right? I'm not necessarily going to know tomorrow how to hook up a router, but the learning in the moment is what I need. Keep in mind, there's different types of microlearning. Match the right type of microlearning to the right need so that your learners have, or your participants have, what they need when they do the microlearning. Make it purposeful. I think that's really important in terms of designing it. And finally, think of, when we talk about the ecosystem, think of microlearning as kind of a maturity model, right? So you might dabble in it or have started using microlearning, and now you're comfortable with that. So what's the next level in a maturity model? Maybe it's rolling out to support coaching or to support leadership. And then once that happens, is there a higher level? So think about how you can integrate microlearning into your ecosystem, and thinking of it as a kind of a maturity level model where you're kind of growing and changing and getting to a more enterprise approach rather than an instance of microlearning, is really a good way to think about implementing and making microlearning happen. So that's what I had in my quick session on microlearning. I'm again excited everybody's going to get a copy of the book, but if you have any questions or want to follow my thoughts on microlearning or gamification on Twitter, feel free to do so. Reach out on LinkedIn if you'd like to, but be happy to answer. I don't know if we have, Josh, I think we have a couple moments for questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody had concerning microlearning or implementing it or anything along those lines.
Karl, thank you. Thank you so much for the time. I mean, amazing. 50 minutes, and the amount of knowledge that we just got in 50 minutes is just outstanding. So we definitely appreciate your time. Obviously, it's a busy schedule that you have going on right now down there. So we definitely appreciate all those insights that you're able to deliver. There's no questions currently, but if anybody does have questions, Karl's contact information is on the screen, and feel free to email him. And make sure that you do follow him on Twitter. I mean, the insights that you can get from his travels around the globe, working with world-class companies and individuals, is fantastic, especially when it comes to this learning and development industry. Karl, a couple takeaways that I had that I found very interesting. Don't assume that 1 hour of learning can be chunked up into 5 minutes and it all becomes micro learning. Great insight, because I see people doing that each and every day that we're working with them here at MLevel. And then really having the appropriate lens for knowing who you're going to be creating the training for. I think too often people create training for themselves rather than the individuals that the training's being created for. And finally, everybody that has attended this session with Karl will be receiving a book. So make sure that you look forward to Karl's book coming. I've already read it. I got it on a Friday night and it was done before midnight. So Amazon was great to deliver that and share it. And then I was excited to see some references to MLevel within the book. So Karl, we really appreciate your time.
No, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the great case studies in the book. It really, I think, added a lot to the realism of what we were talking about and showed that this isn't just theory, it actually works. And if you implement it correctly, you can have fantastic results. So thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you again, Karl. And we're going to go ahead and take a quick break here. We're going to be coming back with Matthew Daniel, the principal and founder from the Learner Collective. We'll be joining back in here in approximately 6 minutes.